I recently finished watching the BBC News, and one subject that caught my attention was the conviction of the five young Islamists in Luton, England, who were convicted of uttering threats in regard to the homecoming of a British military unit from, I believe it was Iraq. They were apparently, they staged a loud demonstration where they accused British soldiers of being rapists, murderers, baby killers, the usual things that are alleged soldiers do in a particularly dirty war. Vietnam springs to mind. They were convicted on the 11th of January, today, at least today in Canada. And the whole subject of Islamism in Europe is something that's always intrigued me. I often wonder what it is about Europe or Europe's Muslims that bring them so often to loggerheads. Now, I'm not trying to tell anyone that Canada does anything correctly. I'm a Canadian, as I always like to point out. But it's been my experience that generally, although there are some spectacular exceptions to this, Canada's Muslims are fairly well integrated into society. They don't really cause much of a fuss. They don't... they fit in. They're generally, I think, as far as I understand it, their level of income is slightly higher than the average. They tend to be educated, ambitious people, and even if they don't necessarily assimilate, they tend to integrate. I rather suspect that the same thing is true in the United States. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on Europe, but I have traveled widely in Europe. Very few Western European countries I have not visited, Scandinavia being the exception. I haven't been to a single Scandinavian country. But I've been to Italy and Spain, France. I lived in England for a while, Ireland, a lot of different places. And one thing that sort of struck me is the fact that, with some exceptions to this, Europe has not been successful in integrating or assimilating its Muslim minority. At least it doesn't seem to be as visibly integrated or assimilated as they seem to me to be in North America. And I've often wondered why that is the case. Why is it that you've got young Muslim men in Britain who are loudly demonstrating against the armed forces of their own country, which is fine actually, but in a particularly horrible way, in a particularly offensive way. Soldiers have long since gotten used to the fact that civilians don't necessarily like them, but the kind of thing that one saw taking place in Luton last March, I think it was in many ways, to my mind at least, symptomatic of the divide between Islamic and general society in Europe, or perhaps, to go one step broader, the divide between the immigrant and indigenous communities in Europe versus my experience, at least, my own personal experience, and I have nothing else to go on, I haven't done a study, of ethnicity and integration and immigration in North America. Now, I've come up with a couple of explanations for this, or at least a couple of ideas that I put to myself about this. Again, they're just things that I formulated myself. First of all, I think North America has a culture of immigration which Europe doesn't really have. Although, oddly enough, almost every race of people in Europe that calls itself indigenous is, in fact, an immigrant from, or a race that has actually come in from another part of Europe or perhaps another part of the world. So it's kind of a misnomer to say that any race is particularly indigenous, but I think people understand how the word is colloquially used now, indigenous Europeans. So, first of all, there is such a thing as an Irishman, or there is such a thing as an Italian, there is such a thing as a Pole or a Greek. It's somebody who has a history, a culture that goes back in that part of Europe for a very, very long time. You might have, a Pole will have a name that is recognizably Polish, a Finn will have a recognizably Finnish name. And there are even certain characteristics. People look differently. There's no way that your average German can be compared to, say, your average Greek. They don't look the same at all. Although I suppose there are individuals that could easily be mistaken the one for the other. But generally, each state in Europe has a fairly, I won't say homogeneous population, but a fairly good idea as to what it means to be a member of that, or a citizen of that particular country. Spaniards think a certain way, they have a certain history, that kind of thing, which is true to a certain extent in North America, but it's not quite as well developed because simply, well, Western people, the dominant cultures in North America, simply haven't been here long enough to actually have that length of attachment to that particular piece of land. That's not to say that people aren't attached to it, but the idea of being an American racially or ethnically hasn't really been around as long as, say, that of being an Englishman, or certainly a Greek or an Italian. So foreigners will always sort of stick out as foreigners because, well, they look like they're not from the home country, in Europe, that is. Secondly, Europe, I suppose, is a lot more crowded. There's just not as much room, so when you have people thrust together in large cities, there's inevitably more tension, especially if the people that already live there believe that the country is, as I think it was Pim Fortuyn said, full up. There's already enough people here. We can't take any more. It's not that we, have anything against you, but our society is pretty much full. Finally, I think that one of the reasons why there's a much tougher time in integrating, especially Islamic immigrants, is the fact that they tend to come, at least as far as my eyes tell me, from the more disadvantaged parts of the Islamic world. In North America, as I said, in Canada, the Muslim community tends to do quite well. They tend to, there's plenty of doctors, there's psychiatrists, lawyers, businessmen, wealthy people with big houses and large cars, and a good, healthy, solid middle class of Muslim people. So people of this, I would say, educational level tend to be less likely to start waving signs and being offensive in public than, say, someone who's a high school dropout or is otherwise frustrated with his or her life. Canada's Muslims, in my understanding, is they're comfortably middle class, comfortably bourgeois, and they don't. Those sorts of people are not the ones that are likely to do anything socially disruptive. Again, there are exceptions to this. I'm not saying that there aren't, but the general rule is one of a community that has successfully integrated itself into the larger society. Simply because, as I said, I think that in North America the Islamic community comes from what one would call the educated middle classes of the Islamic world. My impression of the Islamic communities in Europe, or at least the people that I've seen with my own eyes on my visits there, was that they tend to be a little bit more educationally backward, I suppose. I won't say that they all are. There's probably plenty of very successful and professional Muslims in Europe. But the general picture, as far as I understand it, is that the Muslim communities that are coming to Europe are coming in search of economic advancement because they have nothing at home, not because they want to do better as doctors or lawyers. In other words, they're coming there to wash dishes. They're coming there to occupy positions on the lower rung of the economic ladder. It's just a thought. It's just something that's always interested me, and I wonder why it is. It does seem to be a shame that this kind of thing tends to take place, at least as far as I understand it, more often in Europe than in North America. Although, again, we've got plenty of problems of our own. I'm not saying that we're superior in any way at all, but it is something that interests me. Thank you.